All right, we are picking up on a tutorial that I have started before, and it's a tutorial about the CSS Zen Garden and how to take this code and actually work with it and make something interesting and dynamic and create an experience. This is what we accomplished last class, which is playing around with that H1s, H2s, worrying about divs, adding fonts, and we kind of relaxed in the middle. And then the other day we also talked about select a design section. So we're picking out all these key points. Today we're going to concentrate on animating the header at the top and working on these 5 buttons at the bottom: HTML, CSS, CC, Creative Commons, Ally to access the site, and GitHub. So where do we start from here? Well, we're going to start with transitions and keyframes, 2 big subjects with CSS3. And if we come over here, let's just look at what a transition is. So a transition is a property that allows elements to change value over a specific duration, animating the property changes rather than having them occur immediately. So if you look at this example, that's a class, we have the rule transition with a period, colon after it. We're going to tell it what the transition property is, how long it's going to last, how the timing function, so is it going to ease in, and if you want a delay. And this delay is not necessary. If you want a delay, then you would put it there at the end. If you don't have to worry about it. There's a ton of different transition properties that you can choose from. I can come down here and I'll show you this entire list. Background color can change, background image, only gradients can change. The background position, which is what we're going to modify today. Border color can change, color of the font can change, font size, lettering, opacity. Text shadow can change. All these different things can change, and we're specifically going to deal with them then when they change on hover. So when you roll over an image, let's have an effect occur. And we're going to do this all with CSS3 and transitions, not messing with the HTML at all. Okay, so let's hop over to where we left off, and I'm going to be using brackets. So I'm going to have that up, and I'm going to kind of condense this so we can see some things happen in real time using brackets. Again, we can't touch this HTML code. That's the whole point of CSS Zen Garden. So the only thing we really do want to see here is our naming, our footer, and how it's treated and what the classes are called. So I'm going to come down here, boom, 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 all the way down to the footer, which starts right here. And if you click on it in brackets, you can see that it highlights the end of the footer, which is at the bottom. And we're only dealing with this small section of our website. So the first thing we want to do is look at what it looks like. It's so plain. It's just the blue standard default text, underlined, not centered. It looks really dreadful. So we're going to make some modifications to that. We can also see here that each one is a link. So it's an A tag. And they all have different classes. So the first one has zen-validate-html. Second, zen-validate-css. Next one, zen license, zen accessibility, and zen GitHub. So these are all the different images that we're going to kind of play around with. And what I'm going to do is change the link color, change what happens on rollover, and also create an icon to go underneath each one of these links that when I roll over, it kind of raises maybe like 25% up in the div, and it just kind of bounces up slowly and then bounces down. So we're creating a little bit of interactivity. All right, now that we know the code that we're dealing with, all these classes are very relevant. The footer and the A tag are all relevant. Let's come over to our CSS and start building it out. So I'm going to do this up in the screen and general section of my HTML. And I always start with the most general tags and just keep digging deeper. So the first one we're going to do is the footer. and put the squiggly squiggly. We're also going to deal with the footer A tag, the A active, which is the clickable link that's in the footer. We're also going to deal with the footer on hover. So when this A active link is on a rollover, what is it going to look like? How do we want it to change? And we're getting this again all from right here. Here's the footer A, the A that's in the footer. And then the A hover is just the rollover parameters. Okay, now that we have that basic in there, let's give it a couple identities and rules so we can make this work. I'm going to start off by giving the footer a width, as we always do. And I'm going to give it just a width of 100%. And I'm going to come down here so we can see this kind of happen in real time. I'm going to do margins auto, so it centers that div in the middle. And then I'm going to put a little bit of a margin just on the bottom of 15%. So what you can see here is I classify that all margins are automatic. So they're all going to be auto centering things in the middle of our body. But then I'm overriding the auto bottom with the 15%. So if I just say margin auto, that's going to happen to the top, the left, the right, and the bottom. Everything's auto. But then I can go back and override the bottom with a 15% by putting it after. The key is after. CSS reads from the top down. That's why we can give all these general properties and then override in the tablet and then override in the mobile. So we're just giving it a little bit of parameters here once we start working in the space. So for this A, we want to give it some things to go on here, just basic properties. So I'm going to have these be float left. I'm not using the flex on these. I'm going to give it a margin of 3%. So I want a little bit of space around each one. You can see that margin 3% kind of put a little space. If I would take this away, it's all tight up. They're just butting up against each other because they're float left. Float left, float left, float left. Adding this margin puts 3% on either side, putting 6% in the center. I'm also going to give them an absolute width because I know what size my icons are, and they're 75 pixels. So again, we space this out even more. I'm going to text align center. So our text is in the center of each one of the A's, as you can see. So if I would undo this, just to go back, you can see that it would still be in the 75 pixel space, but it would be left aligned. So I'm putting it right smack in the middle, which is helpful. I hate that little underline when it's on normal. So I'm going to do text decoration none. I don't mind if it is on rollover. I don't know if you need it, at least for this over here. And let's give it a different color so it's not that default. And I'm going to choose one of these blues from what is inside my existing documents. I think it's one of the blues at the top. There we go, nice and soft. All right, so now we have our link, and if you notice we have, if I come over here and test it out, our rollover is non-existent. So I'm just gonna give it a really basic rollover in my A hover. And for this case, I'm just gonna do text decoration line through. I hate how it keeps going to the top. So you can just see that a line goes through the middle, kind of crossing it out. All right, now let's get to the fun stuff. So that was the basic, just setting up our div, ready to rock and roll. And you can see here, if I make this larger, it is going to go 100% of our space within here. Okay, and let's close that back up because we want to work in this area. So next up now I want to deal with the specific classes within each one because I want to give each one a different icon. And I can do this by specifying what I want the Zen Validate HTML to look like, the Zen Validate CSS, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to do period Zen Validate.html. And I'm getting this class from, in my footer, here's the class name. So you can copy and paste if you often misspell. So I'm going to come over here. And then I'm also going to give another property that is called period Zen validate. Copy and paste when you need to. Colon hover. So what this div would look, this class would look like on hover. This is going to be the base for all of these buttons. So you want to make sure the first one works before you start swapping out images. All right, let's do this. Let's go back up to the top. I'm going to give it a background. I'm going to press enter just so you can see this a little better. I'm going to give this a background URL. In my images folder, and I have one called heart. I'm going to put no repeat. So if we come down here, we don't see anything happening yet. We need to give it some width and height. We need to actually give it a space to live in this background image. And that's one of the tricky things about using background images in CSS. Whoops, this should be up here. So we're saying just this heart image that if I scroll over, I think you can see it. There it is, a 75 by 75 heart. And it's not going to repeat. It's once and done. Now let's give it another property here of a width and height. And I'm going to give the height a little bit more because it does have that link in it. It's not a once and done thing. We want to move this down then, see how it's at the top. So we have this space. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add to this and just say my background position is going to be center bottom. So it's in the center of the 75 pixels and at the bottom. Now this could be up here as a shortcode. We could do that as well. Whatever option you want, the shorthand or a little bit longer. These are the same and they will just overwrite each other. So now that we have the background image in there, we have the width and height. Now we're going to do this transition that I was just talking about. And coming back to my Word document, this transition is the transition property, which in our case is going to be the background position. So instead of being all the way at the bottom, I wanted to move up and ease up to about 25 pixels higher than it already is. How long does it want to take? Maybe it should be a second or a little bit less, like 0.7, 0.5, and it's going to ease in. So it's going to start off a little slower and then get a little faster. And we'll talk about different easing properties. Or it could just be linear, which we'll just do it in real time. So how do we do this? Let's go down here and we'll do transition. We're transitioning the background position. It's going to be 0.7 seconds, so a little bit less than a second, and it's going to ease. So it's going to ease in. Save. We're going to have to come back and do some prefixes for that, but we'll give that 1 second. But if we do this, it's, we didn't really specify what that is yet. So nothing's going to happen. We just said the background position is going to change and it's going to take this long and it's going to ease in, but what is going to change about it? That's what we're going to do on the hover. So this effect is taking place on the hover. So down here, the only thing I have to do is put the change. So background position and I still want it to be center, but I want it to move up 25 pixels. So now when I roll over this, it moves up 25 pixels. Pretty amazing. So let's just review what we did there and add our prefixes. So I came over here and I said I want the background to be a heart. I want it to be centered and at the bottom of the div, not repeating. I want the div itself to be 75 pixels width and 140 height. Hence, we have some room for it to come up. Then I made this transition that the background position is going to change in a little bit less than a second. It's going to ease in. And then here in the hover of that class, I'm going to say it's going to stay centered still, but move up 25 pixels. Now let's do our prefixes. So we have to do 4 transitions: WebKit, transition, and you can always copy and paste. And so we're going to copy and paste this. You need to do the WebKit, and you also should do the Moz. Eventually, everyone will catch up. Save. Let's see how far we do have to back up here. So I'm going to come over to my browser and say, can I use .com? And here again, we can test out, can we use some of these amazing CSS3 effects yet? So I'm just going to put in transition. This is page transition, CSS transitions. Here we go. So right now, if you have an updated browser across the board, except for Opera Mini, it would work. It's not going to work. It's not supported on Opera Mini yet. Who has Opera Mini? I'm not sure. But you can see, though, one behind, it is supported, but you go one more behind, and, you know, we start getting into some messy land. So, better safe than sorry that all your users see the same code. Now that we have that done, I want to do this for the rest of my different buttons, but I am not going to type this whole thing out again. So this one works. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to copy both the class and the hover. Paste it. And I'm going to change out to my other classes. So if we come over here, the next class is Zen Validate CSS. I'm going to use that here. zenvalidate.css. Come down here and do it for the hover as well. And I'm just going to change out my image so it's not a heart. There's some other ones in there. There's a camera, there's coffee, and you can see here now it's going to add that in and do the same effect. The only thing you have to change for each one of these is the name of the class on both, the hover as well, and change the background image. So I want you to do that for all 5 of them. I think there's 4 icons in there, but duplicate one. So each one should have a little icon that elevates really slowly when we go over. All right, that worked great. Now let's do one more thing, that's animation. So transition versus animation. We're gonna dive deeper into that. But I'm gonna come back here, and if you go all the way to the bottom of your HTML, you'll see there's some extra divs down here. And these, you know, it kind of has this little warning like, these days you should use this and this, we favor instead, but there's a couple divs down here at the bottom that you can use. Eventually they might go away, you know, star, star, star. Well, I'm going to use one of those because I want at the top of my design to have a plane go through the background. I want it to go behind the text and just go through here and just slowly float across. And I'm going to use this first div, this extra one, to do that. There's some wiggle room on this site. So underneath, after all my 5 icons are working perfectly, I'll hit enter a couple times so you can see. And I'm going to use one of those extra divs. So it'll be that period extra 1. And in this extra 1 is where I can do this plain animation. So we're going to do a couple things here that's going to help this to work in the best possible way. So we're going to set some parameters. I'm going to make this a little smaller so we can hopefully see this happen. There we go. So first thing I'm going to do is set my background image, right? I know I want this plane in there. So I'm going to do background URL. And I'm going to tell it that I want it to go in the images folder. And I think it's plain.png. And I obviously do not, I want this to be center, and I want it to be at the top, and I do not want it to repeat. I want one plane. Okay, so we don't see anything yet, right? Nothing. So now let's give it some more properties. We obviously have to give it a width and a height so we can actually see it. Let's give it a width of 50% and a height of 40%. I'm going to do margins auto. We just want it to kind of live in the space. And, you know, these sizes, as we look at this, oops, let's scroll over this. No space after URL, obviously important, didn't like that. We have this plane that's 400 by 300. It's going to just coast across the front. And what we're going to do to just make this kind of be contained in this space is we're going to use a new property of background size. And we used background size many times before, and you're going to be using it for to cover, right, if we wanted to cover the entire div. So if we did that, you know, it's going to have a totally different effect if we would say contains, which is going to be contained in the div, not covering it from the left to the right, to the top to the bottom, containing in it. So something a little bit different we're playing around with. Next thing is I'm going to do absolute position. So position absolute. And I have to give it a position. So I'm going to tell it that I want it at the top of my whole CSS page. And this is kind of coming from your last class. There we go. It's showing up finally. So it's absolute position all the way at the top of my page. And I want it on the left, also further on the left. And I'm going to give negative 400. Reason that is I want it off the side of the page. So we can't see it, but it's right over here, off to the side. And if we want, we can leave that out for a minute. I'll just put negative 40 or something so we can see it. Eventually, you're going to want to change that. So now we have absolute position at the top of the page. It's contained in the div, which is going to work well for responsive. We gave it a width and a height and all that good stuff. And I think now, oh, one more thing. Let's move it behind this text. So see, it's going in front of it. So we can just give it a Z index, which is basically like a layers. And I'll just say negative 100. And you can see it moved right to the back. So it can just skirt along the back of this. Great, sounds good. So what we're going to want to do next, now that we have a width and a height and our margin, we have the background size, now we want to actually give it an animation. So within the same realm, I'm just going to move down, still here in extra one, and I'm going to say animation, colon. Now, what am I doing here? Let's just go to animation, CSS3. And I want to do some shortcuts for that. So if you look here at this website, CSS Tricks, which I live by, you can see here that you have your element, in this case extra one, and you want it to animate. And here it's going to pulse for 5 seconds infinitely. It's just going to keep pulsing. So notice here it's just pulsing this color right underneath. So what is it pulsing for 5 seconds infinitely is this keyframe that we called pulse, hence the name right above. And here at 0%, so right in the beginning, frame number 1, the background's this color. By 100%, at the end of the 5 seconds, the background is this color. Animation uses keyframes to show this timeline of effects. And the great thing about this is you can have 0 to 5 to 10 to 20 to 50%, 70%, 61, etc., and you can really show a whole timeline of events, different than a transition that you're just giving a property or several that'll just go in this span. Pretty amazing. So the interesting part here is that we want to start with a name, and this name we're going to talk about later. So in this case, I'm just going to say plane. Makes sense. It's a plane. I want this plane to fly across the screen at let's try 8 seconds. So it's a nice slow transition across the page. He's not like zooming a fighter plane coming through. I want it to keep happening. So I'm going to use that same one, the infinite. And I don't want it to ease in or anything. And you don't even have to worry about this if you didn't want to. So we'll just let that go for now. We could put one more parameter of easing. It can ease in, ease out. Here's another transition you can see. We can transition more than items, but this is always great. So here's the timing methods I was talking about. So you can ease, ease out, ease in and out. So it starts slow, gets its pace, and then goes out slowly. Or linear, that it stays the entire time. Or you could be really specific with qubit Bezier, which there's websites that I can give you to show really specific parameters of X and Y, yada, yada. I'll just do linear so you can see where this will go. So we did that. The next thing we're going to have to do is just set a little bit of prefixes again. So we do have to do the Moz and WebKit. So I'll copy this, come right above, paste, paste. This one is dash WebKit. This one is dash Moz. And now we covered all our bases very nicely. So we have our animation set in there. And the last thing we have to do is tell it now, what is this animation going to do? What is the key frames for this animation? And if we come back here, let's just see, you know, it's coming across in this linear way. Let's give it some more parameters. So down here now in my keyframe, so underneath, I'm going to do keyframe, at keyframe. It should turn nice and purple. I'm going to do my plane. And we'll put a squiggly squiggly. So in that squiggly squiggly, just like the media queries, we're going to put some more in here. So I'm going to say at 0%, I want the plane to be at the left, negative 400 pixels. So this has to be 400 too. So it's our starting point. Easy. Then I'm going to say, you know, at 100%, I want it to be from the left 2,000 pixels. So it's going to go all the way off on the other side. So now we're giving it specific parameters from the 0 to 100. I could put in between. So say I could put, you know, 42% here in the middle, that I say I want it from the left now only 40 pixels. So what this is going to do is it's going to really go a little bit slower and then kind of fly. So it comes in slow and then zips off. So you can really give a lot of parameters here for the plane and setting left, right, top, bottom, all these good directions for animation. Opacity is also a good one. Last thing we have to do here, let me close this up so it's a little tighter, is you have to still do, again, the keyframe prefix. So I'm going to copy this again, and one more time. You're going to keep the at on these two, but you're going to do the dash after. WebKit, dash, and Moz. So now when I look at this plane is infinitely going across my screen. It looks great. It starts out nice and slow and then kind of zooms off. And if I come down here, you should have 5 buttons. I only did 2 for this tutorial for time, but 5 buttons that all kind of hop when you roll over.